working. So
Where do you live?
I live in Southern California.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah. Meeting is now streaming live.
there we go. Let me just get that up. And welcome to the program, Charles Moscowitz, live at YouTube and at subscribing platforms. And my guest is Michael Whitcoff. He is the author of On the Masons and Their Lies, What Every Christian Needs to Know. Michael, you also have a new book out, I believe, of poetry. Is that right?
Yes, Theo Poetica, I believe, was published in October. That is my newest contribution to the world.
Wonderful. Well, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on today is because besides that, I just published a book called God is God. God is the creator and the lawgiver. That has led me now to write a sequel to that book, which is going to be and is about Satan. And I get into questions as with a secular background and generally as kind of a skeptic myself of whether, the question of whether or not there is proof that God exists. And if so, what is our relation to God as human beings? And what are we to derive from that relationship?
Mm.
And in the beginning of the book, I came up with somewhat of a simple mathematical example and formula to I think that proves that God exists. And I got that from studying some Greek philosophy. And that is basically that you cannot create something out of nothing. That's mathematically impossible. It's the principle of the zero. In other words, 0 plus 0 equals 0, 0 minus 0 equals 0. You cannot make 0 into a thing. It's
Mm.
mathematically impossible. It's the basic axiom of physics and really probably in the broad sense of much of our scientific understanding. And so if you cannot create something out of nothing, then how is it that the universe came about with all of its incredible multiplicity of aspects, trillions of parts that function and interact with each other and fit together and that are perfectly formed? How could this have happened out of nothing? And the answer is that the only way it could happen is through God. There had to have been a supernatural cause. It's something that is beyond nature in order to create the natural world that we know and that we function in and that we can identify. So to my way of thinking, that simple mathematical formula is a basic and obvious and sensible proof that there has to be a God, the creator. What do you think?
I well, I mean, obviously, I agree with you. It's interesting because the secular theory of the Big Bang, how a thing happened and then there was nature, essentially. If you actually push them on this and you ask them, okay, but how did that happen? How did that happen? How did that happen? They inevitably end up at one of two conclusions, which is either I don't know or it just happened, which is to say it was created out of nothing. So in a certain sense, if you push them deeply enough about their belief, they end up believing in some creative force, whether they're calling it God or something else, or just admitting their ignorance. So I don't think there's really a secular theory that even competes with the Christian worldview and Jewish worldview of creating out of nothing and of there being a first cause or an unmoved mover in Aristotle's language. What Greek philosophers were you studying as you tried to kind of parse this whole thing out?
I think that I got that from reading Parmenides, or was it Herodotus, one of the two,
Okay.
who talked about the principle of the zero. I think that also Pythagoras gets into this, and that the zero is zero and one is one. And it was basically a formula to identify existence. I'm not sure that they took it the next step in terms of believing in God. I think that, as you say, Aristotle went the next step with the idea of the prime mover, the primus mobile.
Mm.
But I don't think that he brought that to the idea that, I think that his view is similar to that of Eastern philosophy and maybe Hindu and Buddhist ideas, which is that there is no creation. Everything just exists. How that came about, they don't know, but somehow there's just a continuum, that there's no beginning, there's no end, which to maybe my Western mind is not acceptable and seems obviously to not be the case, because if you accept that as a principle, then there's no progress, there's no meaning, there's no reason to advance. Everything just sort of folds in of itself. Everything is equal. We're no different than any other particle in the universe. There's nothing unique or different about consciousness in a way. It's
Yeah.
just that everything is what it is. It's kind of a, it's a worldview that I think predominated in Eastern cultures. I think that today, in today's world, I think the Bible is the predominant, in a sense, blueprint for the world, and has been particularly in the Christian age. And so I think that even though they may continue to embrace those ideas, I think generally the world is a biblical world today, at least when it comes to the views of average people.
I think you're right. This nihilism, the sense that nothing matters, human beings are just made of atoms, like every other tree or rock. I think that's the worldview that the secular authorities are pushing on us, because they want to break our connection to spirituality. Obviously, if you're going to overthrow a country, you can't have a united, happy people that feel like their life is full of purpose and meaning. And this is part of the plan that the bad guys have had for a long time, is to break our connection to God. And I think one of the ways they do that is by pushing these alternate worldviews by which there is no meaning, by which consciousness doesn't exist. I mean, this is in a lot of TV shows now, specifically in regards to artificial intelligence and that kind of thing. The conclusion is largely that consciousness isn't real. Have you seen the show called Westworld by chance?
Yes, I have, and it runs on the Julian Jaynes's theory of the bicameral mind, and
Mm.
basically what it is saying is that by simply the two sides of the brain integrating with each other through synapses, these robots develop consciousness. And look, it's an interesting theory, but I don't think it bears any scientific basis. It's not. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that consciousness simply happened when human beings were created by God. And another quote that I put in my book, and I get this idea, is from Noam Chomsky, the
Mm.
left-wing the dialectician and a professor emeritus at MIT, who was considered one of the world's most respected linguists. And I had him on my program years ago, and
Okay.
I asked him, I wish I had a tape of it, but this was before the internet. And I said, your theory of language is that it happened all at once. It was not an evolution. It was something maybe analogous to a big bang, that somehow inherently all human beings had the ability to speak at the very beginning of time and use language. So therefore, does that therefore make language to be a unique aspect of consciousness? And doesn't that contradict your belief in the theory of evolution? Because language didn't evolve. And his reaction was to yell and kick and scream. But then we moved on to other subjects.
Mm.
But in a way that verifies the creation narrative, that men and women were created in the image of God, and they were created instantaneously, and that they were given certain properties, and among them was the ability of language, by which they could then have consciousness in the form of expression, the storage of information and values, the documentation of knowledge and the accumulation of knowledge. And that the first command that God delivered to Adam was to name all of the creatures in the world, right, by name.
Yeah.
So, these things make sense. I mean, to my way of thinking, and a general theme throughout the book, is that there really is ultimately no contradiction between faith and science. Because if you believe that there is a God, then that's science, as much as it's faith. And it's an inherent part. And if you remove God from the equation, then what you have is sheer materialism. You're denying an entire aspect of existence by looking at everything as just a bag of matter.
Mm.
That there are, And I also got this from a bit of study of St. Thomas Aquinas,
Mm.
who talked about the idea that there are eternal axioms that exist in the abstract, and that they are as much a creation of God as is the earth and the planet, the plants and things that we see, and that while God separated himself from his creation and is not his creation, which is pantheism, nevertheless, God can intervene, and the way he intervenes is something that's not accessible to us. It's a mystery.
Mm. So out of curiosity, so are there a lot of Jewish sources on this, or are you reading Aquinas and the Greek philosophers because you found there wasn't as much on this topic in the kind of Jewish literature as there are maybe in the Christian or the Greek world?
Well, I'm not as versed in the Jewish sources. I did look at Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, and Maimonides was a contemporary of Aquinas, and I think they corresponded with each other.
I thought Maimonides was like ancient.
No, Maimonides was 12th century, I'm pretty sure.
Really? Hold
Yeah,
on,
I mean,
I
he
have to
was,
look now because I'm very misled if that's
check
true.
it out. Yeah, I believe Maimonides was 12th century. He was not ancient.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, he was, I think he was, he
Yeah,
lived,
you're right.
yeah, he was, I think he was from Spain during the so-called Spanish Golden Age, they call it in Jewish history.
Huh.
And then he,
Yeah.
once that went sour, he emigrated to Egypt, where he had influence over Christian world, Muslim world, and Jewish world, a very profound thinker. And one of his contributions, besides codifying the Talmud, was his book, The Guide to the Perplexed, which has always been controversial in Jewish circles, in the same way that I think Aquinas was controversial in Catholic circles, because he synthesized Greek philosophy and knowledge with, his own times and with faith.
Mm. The only thing I remember about Maimonides was the ladder of tzedakah, the rungs of the ladder of tzedakah, which I still think is good. Are you familiar with the ladder that I'm talking about?
No,
So
I know the 13 principles of faith.
No, it's basically the ranking of charity, levels of charity. So the highest level of charity is you give to people that don't know who gave them money, and also you don't know who you're giving to. So
Yes, I've heard
at a lower level, they know who's giving, like you give them money to their face.
Yeah.
Because then there's gratitude involved and you get a good feeling out of that. Whereas if you give to someone you don't know, they don't have a chance to thank you. So it requires, I think this is probably his logic, a greater degree of inner charity, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, I think I've heard of that. I mean, it's like when somebody has to have their name, tacked onto a building, at a college,
exactly.
it's sort of, they're not going to do it anonymously. And it's like, you all know that they're only named there because they had money, it's not because they did anything beyond, that accomplishment. So, yeah, I mean, there's some great knowledge there. But going back to the question of the existence of God, I mean, I think that conversely, as I studied the idea that there is a God and that there is a role for man to understand who God is by understanding existence and reality and these axioms of morality, and then building a society based upon that, there's also the converse, which is the Satanic influence.
Mm.
And that is bringing man away from God. It's sort of a denial of God. And it's not that Satan, I mean, and I think this is maybe more of a Jewish understanding. It's not that Satan is this anthropomorphic figure dressed in, red tights and running around with a tail.
Mm.
It's more that it's a vacuum of good, that God is good, and that if you step away from God and engage in ideas that are anti-God in the sense that they're not natural, they violate the nature of the universe, then you have opened the door to the Satanic influence, and that is something that every human being deals with. I think that the Christian concept, which I think is, I don't know, probably embraced by Judaism somewhere. I haven't been able to find it, but I think it is the 7 deadly sins, and that those are the snares that draw us away from the good and that which is natural. And that's where you have a Satanic influence put its nose under the tent and wheedle its way into our midst.
Well, the seven deadly sins is not a dogmatic concept. Even the number of sins will change depending on who you ask. So deadly sins is more of a Catholic thing than an Orthodox thing, because there's a section in, it's either the Gospel of John or one of John's epistles, that talks about what Catholics call mortal or venial sin, where there's a sin that leads to death and sin that doesn't. So, and that's, for some reason we don't talk about that in Orthodoxy, even though it's right in the Bible. So if it's in the Bible, it's true as far as we're concerned,
Yeah.
regardless of what you call it. But even that, so it's basically that there's different kinds of sin. Like, for example, if I curse at someone in traffic, that would probably not be as bad of a sin as sleeping with someone's wife.
Right.
So they're both sin, but they're different grades of sin. So for us, we say that the only deadly sin, or this isn't a dogmatic statement again, but it's something I've heard that I like, that the only deadly sin is the one you don't repent for. So even though there are grades of gravity, those come along with different penitence, which some priests give heavy penitence, some don't at all. Like cursing in traffic, you're not going to be excommunicated for that necessarily, but adultery, you certainly will be for a while. You won't be able to approach the chalice for a while. But no, the thing you said about Satan being a negation of good is also very much a Christian idea. It's the same figure, because we don't believe that evil has an ontological existence. There's a principle called evil. It's just a lack of good or a negation of good. So it's not that God created the concept of evil. It's just that this angel he created was not good, and that is what evil is.
Right, and angels are not. I mean, one of the primary questions I'm asking at the beginning of my book about Satan is that how can there be evil? Because people ask this, is that how can there be evil in the world if God is good and that God is one, and is evil a separate entity? Doesn't that contradict the idea of the oneness of God? And I mean, I don't think it does, because I think that evil happens in the absence of God. It's like a rejection of God.
Yeah,
and that. It was Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel who addressed this question in his book, God's Search for Man, when he was asked about, well, how can there be a Nazi Holocaust if there is a God? And his answer was, this is not a question to ask God. This is a question to ask our fellow man. This is a human creation that existed because an entire collective organization or group or nation rejected God. And yet, if we look at history, we see a lot of nations and individuals, and it's kind of a contradiction, who seem to get great benefit from sin and from satanic practices. They get rich.
Yeah.
They become powerful, and there doesn't seem to be consequences to it. And nations have been built on it. In fact, most nations have been built that exist today on maybe levels of genocide, and war, and exploitation and conquest.
I mean, even in the Old Testament, that's how they were built. You look at what the people of Israel did to the land of Canaan, and it goes back to the beginning.
Right. Although in that case, I think that was a very unique case in that they were commanded by God to do that for reasons that I don't even claim to begin to understand, and it's troubling. But nevertheless, I don't think they wanted to do it. I think they didn't really complete it, but they felt that they were commanded to do it and they had to do it.
I think I've tried to justify some of that stuff in the Old Testament. I think the best way, at least from a Christian perspective, is to say God had to get the people of Israel to the country or the area of Israel or Palestine, whatever you want to call it, so that Christ could be born there. So it was part of the economy of salvation or the plan of salvation. So you have to get them there by any means necessary. But we also have a concept, according to some of our saints, that if something in the Bible, and specifically in the Old Testament, comes off as really immoral or evil, as there are some passages that do, like when Elijah calls down bears to maul the 42 children, for example, when he summons the murdered bears, that those passages have to be interpreted allegorically as well. So the way the church fathers have always interpreted those passages, in addition to the historical interpretation, is that the nations, the pagan nations, are to be interpreted as the demons that influence us towards sin. Mm-hmm. So by conquering these pagan nations, what it's really saying is conquering the legions of demons, essentially, that might be promoting fornication and adultery and murder and rape and all that stuff. So we try to have the spiritual meaning of it as well. That's what you'll find in all of the church fathers who wrote texts on the Old Testament, at least.
Interesting. I mean, I think that probably the Jewish conception is similar in that it's easy to look back today and make a judgment when we cannot know what was really going on 6,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And that, in fact, these nations had reached such a level of evil in terms of what idol worship is. And idol worship is not just sitting around and praying to some graven image. There was some horrendous and evil practices that went along with that, like throwing the infant baby into the belly of a burning, stone idol, or in the case of Baal, putting the baby on the hands of this gigantic, iron infrastructure that was burning, and watch the baby, burn to death and scream. And then you'd have musicians playing music so that they would drown out the sound. And all the various practices that went on around the idol, not to mention the fact that the idol is a man-made entity that was controlled by people in power and was used as a way to control nations. And, that these nations had reached such a level of depravity, like as in the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, that they threatened to infect the entire world, that they could have. It's like why God brought the flood. And then had the covenant saying he would never again flood the world. But yet these nations threatened they threatened the future of existence to such a level that they had to be destroyed.
One of my friends at church is much more well-read in all this stuff than I am. And he also has said that the Canaanites were kind of the half demon, half human children of the fallen angels, the giants or the Nephilim or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
So that was part of why it was okay to kill all those people, is because they were actually demon spawn as well. Yeah. I'm not sure. I haven't looked into it that closely.
I mean, that sounds like midrash to me. And those things, those sorts of allegories are helpful in understanding these situations. And also from a moral standpoint, it makes us think about what it is that was so evil that they were taken out. But of course, the danger to this study is that there are no more Canaanites today. I mean, you don't have a Canaanite nation today that should be taken out. God isn't telling the children of Israel or anyone else to destroy and to commit genocide today. And right. So, you can have insane movements now who think they're commanded by God to commit atrocities. And that to me is a rejection of God, because that particular situation happened at that particular time and in those particular circumstances, and it's never happened since.
Yeah, I've actually been reading a lot of books about fascism lately, the different movements from the 20th century and the way the church interacted with them. And you were talking about Germany. So Hitler didn't believe in a religion. He claimed to be Catholic, right? He was born Catholic. Right. He claimed to be Catholic when he thought he could manipulate the Catholic Church to do his bidding and to try and gain political power over them. But if you actually read through any stuff he said, he always just talks about providence, how providence put him in charge. Providence wanted to do this, but there's never any real spirituality that went along with it. And interestingly enough, he was the least liked by all the other fascists, it turns out. They tended to think that he was stupid and base and vulgar, as Julius Evola called him. So it's a pretty interesting topic. And actually, there's a whole book about, it's called Controversial Concordates. A concordate is an agreement between the Catholic Church and a secular leader.
Right. So in fact, the first treaty that the Nazis signed was the Concordat with the Vatican. And very controversial because it gave them a certain legitimacy. And the Vatican celebrated it because they felt that it was the end of the Kulturkampf, which had been launched by the Protestant government of Bismarck back in the late 19th century.
Well, Hitler thought Bismarck had made a mistake fighting the church. So he said he wanted to kind of absorb it and change it rather than fight it head on. But all the Catholic bishops were against Hitler in the beginning until Hitler won power legitimately, because the view of the church is that you have to support the authority of the state, even if it's against you. And once they started to realize, well, he did win the elections, I mean, through terrifying people probably in 1932, I think it was.
Yeah, 33.
You're right, March of 1933, you're right. Mm-hmm. Once he won the election, they thought, well, this is the head of the state now, legally and officially. So we have to sign an agreement to team up with him.
Right. And also, I think it's safe to say that the Nazi movement itself was secular socialist, and it was paganistic in its embrace of at least the theoreticians of Nordic myth, of Eastern religion, even to a certain extent of Islam. And not to get into a topic, but there was this book published in the 70s called Table Talk, which probably was a forgery or might have been half true, but it was apparently written by a reporter who was allowed to sit at the dinner table of Hitler and his top thinkers and take notes. And he pointed out that they felt that the victory of Charles Martel in France, which stemmed the Islamic invasion of Europe in, I think, the 8th century, was a tragic day for Europe, because it would have been better had Europe been completely conquered by Islam, because Christianity is a Judaizing influence, and that Islam was more militant, and they would have been able to, they resonated more with this idea of this Islamic idea of jihad and world conquest.
Yeah. That charge has been laid out a lot by these kind of white nationalist pagan types, that Christianity is a Judaizing influence, that it's a subversive movement meant to weaken a nation. That's a very common argument.
Right.
That's part of why St. Augustine wrote City of God, was to refute that argument. And this was back in the 5th century.
Well, I think that Christianity is a Judaizing influence. But
well, Judaizing
in the best sense,
means a specific thing to us.
Well, it's because they embrace the Torah. I mean, you embrace all the moral and ethical precepts of Sinai. That,
moral and ethical stuff, sure.
So in that sense, I think it is. So we have.
Let me say one more thing on that topic.
Please.
They're refuting the idea, or they're arguing that Christianity is a pacifist religion, and saying that's why it tends to get conquered and whatnot. But it's not a pacifist religion. Obviously, Leo Tolstoy, the writer.
Yeah.
He was actually excommunicated from the Russian Orthodox Church for his radical pacifism. We do have specific rules for war, when it can be conducted, how it can be conducted, who has to give the green light for it. But the charge that Christianity just preaches that you should roll over and let your country be conquered, as far as I can tell, is not actually true. But that is often a charge that's laid at our feet. And historically, that's not usually the case either.
Right. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily true in terms of organized Christianity, but I think that the belief system does tend to be pacifistic, in that it's a personal relationship between the believer and God, with Jesus as the intercessor, and that one comes to that relationship voluntarily and personally. And it's not, the idea of force, of use of force or coercion, is not at all part of it, nor was it part of Jesus's ministry himself.
That's very true. In fact, if you read through the Catholic Church's decretals and encyclicals, they're constantly saying that you can't convert people by force, which doesn't mean they didn't try all the time.
No, they did it, but it was in a sense a departure from the faith when they did.
Yeah, but the way that we conceive of pacifism, obviously we're peace seekers. We pray for peace. We try to be peacemakers. If someone attacks you personally for your faith or insults you, that's when you do not respond with force or violence or insults back. This is the ideal. But that's different than someone attacking your country, which is a completely different thing, because if you're responsible for other people, you can't just let them be killed. It's very different than a personal attack. Some saints have actually separated personal enemies, enemies of the nation, and enemies of God, with different responses to each one.
Right, and also to go back to St. Thomas Aquinas, he wrote the doctrine of just war, where he laid out the principles.
It's a much older doctrine than him, but he certainly elaborated it. Yeah.
So, Michael, why Greek Orthodoxy? You didn't grow up in it. You came to it. What was it about Eastern Orthodoxy that caused you to believe that it was, the best doctrine of the truth?
So I grew up Jewish, as we talked about, I think, in our last interview together.
Yeah.
I was bar mitzvahed, and I read my Haftarah portion at one of the high holidays at temple once upon a time, which my grandma made her very proud.
Mm-hmm.
And then I actually read it again. No, I think I only read it that one time after my bar mitzvah. So I did all that. I went to the Birthright trip to Israel when I was 25 or 26.
Right.
So flew out of New York with the Shor Hashim organization.
Oh, yeah, I'm familiar
Birthright,
with them. Yep.
10 days in Israel, all that jazz. But I never was a believer in the tenets of it necessarily. Like when in Sunday school, when the services were happening, I would usually run away to the library. I'd sneak away to the library and read books about World War II or the Polish resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto, stuff like that. I never really bought it. Reading the Old Testament, it always seemed like nonsense to me, frankly. And then I lived a secular life my entire life. For about 10 years, I don't know how familiar you are with this movement, with the manosphere movement on the internet. So the PUAs, the MGTOWs, I was reading all this literature, this pro-male, let's say, literature, organizing my life in such a way that I could be as free in a secular sense as possible, free to sin without consequence, or so I thought.
I never heard of this manosphere. Is it like an atheistic thing, or what's the deal?
Mostly. So it's not as big now as it was 5 or 6 years ago. But the manosphere was a collection of blogs, and then towards the end of that, YouTube channels that would teach men self-improvement, essentially.
Okay.
So it was slandered by the left as being misogynist and all this
Right.
stuff. It was anti-feminist to a large extent.
Sure.
So you had the MGTOWs, the men going their own way, which were guys saying, we're going to turn our backs on society's expectations and just live the way we want, which was mostly guys that had been divorced and got a really bad deal. So they were very angry. And you had the PUAs, the pickup artists. Have you heard of the pickup artist movement?
I've heard of Roosh.
Yeah. Roosh was part of it. He was his blog was one of the major blogs.
Yeah.
So I read all this different material and just basically tried to organize my life in a way that I thought was fun, and being promiscuous and doing drugs and moving whenever I felt like it, just living a really sinful and miserable kind of life.
Right.
And then when I was 28, I had an experience, which I now in retrospect believe was an angelic visitation, which is so hard to describe. I'm not even going to really try to describe it. But essentially, okay, I will try to describe it. Essentially, I had this experience after reading the New Testament for the first time in my life, reading just one line from the New Testament. I got to back up in this story. Okay. So I was involved in some sinful activities, and I got myself into a really bad situation where there was really no winning. It was a no-win situation. If I made one choice, I would lose. If I made another choice, people I cared about would lose. There was no way out. And so after trying to solve it on my own and failing, I thought maybe there's an answer in this Bible thing. I don't know. I don't take it seriously. I don't believe in it. Maybe there's some wisdom in it. Who knows? And someone had given me a Bible a year or two before that I'd never once opened. So I did that thing where you flip through the pages with your eyes closed. You go, okay, I'll stop here. And then you move your finger around. Okay, I'll stop here. And it stopped on 1 John 4:4 in the New Testament, which says, he who is in you, rather, is greater than he who is in the world. And for some reason, I understood what it meant, that, okay, if Jesus or God, I didn't know the difference at the time, or if there was a difference, I didn't know anything. Okay, if this Jesus character is in me and he's greater than the world, and the world is this bad situation, maybe that means if I rely on him, whatever that means, he'll get me out of this situation, right? So I prayed to Jesus for help, which, would have made my Jewish ancestors probably very upset. And the situation worked out with minimal damage, which was incredible. None of the bad outcomes actually happened that should have happened.
Wow.
And after that, I had this experience to confirm that what I'd read was true, where essentially this being appeared to me, not like with my eyes open, not like this water bottle or laptop, but through a spiritual sense, this giant, tall man kind of thing that was just pure light. And being in the presence of this being, it made me realize what sin was, because this thing was so pure that I felt really dirty next to it. And I had never felt like that before. And so being in the presence of purity, that's how I understood what sin was, just comparing my own soul and the way I felt to how I felt in this holy being's presence. I didn't know if it was Jesus or an angel or what. Now I think it was probably an angel. After that, I started going to a Protestant church, which one of my friends had been trying to bring me to for a long time. I said, no, I don't believe in this. I just want to get high and party. I said, okay, I'll come with you. So I went to the Protestant church, and every Sunday And it felt to me like the pastor, it was like God speaking directly to me, addressing my exact situation that I needed to hear on that day. I couldn't believe it. It really was like God was, for the first time, working in my life and showing me, look, this is real, orchestrating situations for me to understand, to help with my wisdom and understanding. And so I went there for about a year and a half, and then I ran into a situation where, I was studying the Bible and learning all this stuff. And there were two things at the church that I didn't understand, which was female pastors and Zionism, because I was reading the New Testament and I thought it pretty clearly said that the word Israel now means the Israel of the Spirit, the followers of Christ, not
from St. Paul, right? I mean, Israel was replaced with the heart, basically.
Essentially, yeah. Well, the church becomes the nation of Israel.
Sure.
Jews and Gentiles, everyone's part of it. So I approached the pastor and I said, hey, what's with the female pastors and the Zionism with the Bible says this? And he said, because this is my church and we do things my way. And I found that answer to be completely not acceptable. So then I thought, okay, is there anything deeper than this? I'd only heard of Protestant and Catholic. And I was telling this to one of my friends. He said, you should look at Orthodoxy. A guy named Neon Revolt, actually, he's very big in the Q movement on Gab, the social media site Gab. But this was before he even had a website.
Right.
Back when he was on Facebook, actually. And so I Googled Greek Orthodox. There was a church 4.5 minutes from my house. So I went and checked it out, and I was fascinated by it, but also horrified, because being a Protestant, seeing, images of Mary on the walls and praying
the icons
about Mary, the icons, all this stuff was very foreign to me. But there was something there that I really liked, and I kind of got bit by the bug.
Okay.
So then I drove to Riverside to meet a man named Father Josiah Trenum, who, if you don't know, you might be interested in Father Josiah. He's a very fascinating guy. He's got 10 kids. He's an archpriest of a huge church. And after that, I decided I wanted to be Orthodox after my meeting with him. So I became Orthodox. There's a lot of reading of history involved. Reading the church fathers, reading the students of the apostles. A lot of Christians don't realize the students of the apostles, some of them wrote letters that we still have.
Sure.
When you see that, you can't be a Protestant anymore, because you see that they're not saying what you're doing. So you have to ask yourself, what's more likely, that I understand the Bible that these guys put together, that I understand this better than their students did, or that their students who can ask them questions directly understood it better than me? So you got to swallow your pride at that point, or at least that's an option available to you. Say, okay, I think these guys knew better. And once you accept that they knew better, you kind of have no choice but to become either Orthodox or Catholic. So then you have to ask yourself what you believe about the Pope. And that kind of is the ultimate determining factor. I decided I don't believe in the Pope. And so then I became Orthodox instead of Catholic. And that's the short version of the story.
Well, I've noticed that there are a lot of very great religious thinkers that I respect on YouTube. People like, Jay Dyer, for example, who are Orthodox.
Sure.
And it's made me wonder, what is it about Orthodoxy that attracts people? And, you're kind of pointing in that direction of what it is. It seems to be a more pure form of Christianity, that it goes back really to the early centuries, and, as you say, some of the doctrines that were written back then that sort of have become obscured are still very much a part of that church. What about, not to change the topic, but since you brought it up, I have to ask.
Sure.
What is the deal with the QAnon?
I mean, how many hours do you have to talk? So I can give you the basics. So QAnon is kind of a misnomer. There's a guy or a team of guys that post on a message board with the signature of just the letter Q.
Right.
For the last 3 years or so, this Q person, who claims to be a high-level intelligence asset, claims to know Donald Trump directly, sometimes takes pictures and posts it from inside Air Force One. So it seems
who
like
is this person?
Well, nobody knows.
Because I've seen a few people that kind of pose. I mean, this guy, this young guy, not Breitbart, Steinbart or somebody.
I don't know.
I see people out there kind of saying that they have the Q, they know the information, and that it's some kind of an intelligence or a couple of people who are on the inside of the so-called deep state who are releasing classified information and trying to get it out.
Well, it might be Ezra Cohen Watnick. That's one theory. He was a big guy in the cyber warfare. I think all the special forces answer to him now recently. He might be him, but the guy posts pictures from inside Air Force One. So obviously he does know Trump. And for 3 years, he's been posting about kind of the inner workings of the deep state. It started with the Russiagate thing, with the Russia hoax, the Russian
Right.
collusion. And that obviously was proved false, that whole
That's
investigation.
right. Yep.
So he claims to be this insider that has all the information, that has enacted this great military plan to capture all the bad guys. And he calls it the Great Awakening, that all the
Right.
bad guys are going to be swooped up and put in Guantanamo Bay. Obviously, none of this has happened. Maybe it will. I hope it does. I don't
Well,
know.
if it does, it's getting awfully late.
That's why a lot of people have stopped believing in it, because he kept saying to trust people that were not trustworthy. Like he said to trust Bill Barr. He made a big deal of Bill Barr for a long time, and Barr just sucks, right?
No, awful.
He
Total
does not.
insider.
He's just been taking a nap for several years, as far as I can tell.
Absolutely.
His Barr's father hired Jeffrey Epstein at the professor job. So he kept saying, trust Barr. It was this big revelation, the stealth bomber, B2, Bill Barr. He was going to do all this, and he did nothing, right? He did nothing about the Epstein investigation. He let that die. None of the Russiagate people are in trouble except for Kevin Kleinsmith, that lawyer.
Right. It's a low-level kind of a peon in the whole thing.
Yeah. But there's the people.
There's the other aspect to the Q that seems to have the left all twisted, and that is that they claim that there is a satanic conspiracy of pedophiles at the very top levels of intelligence, government, culture, and that they're doing stuff, with the blood of children. And, there's a lot of stuff. Now, I mean, I have no idea. I do think, however, that there is certainly nothing wrong with investigating such things. Is there pedophilia? I mean, this is,
absolutely,
I mean, this is a big one. I mean, I think that Trump actually has gone after this. At least that's my understanding.
Yeah. So I'm not a huge fan of a lot of things Trump has done. I support him and I want him to win re-election, and I totally support stopping the steal, and I want the Supreme Court to rule in his favor, obviously.
Yeah.
He's done a lot of stupid things, but one of the things he's done really well is arresting pedophiles and rescuing children. It's probably the best thing he's done, honestly.
Right.
And it's never publicized. He doesn't talk about it, which I think he should talk about how good of a job he's doing. It's never in the media on either side. He's done a great job with that. It's very bizarre to me to hear people deny the existence of satanic pedophiles in high levels of government and also cover the Jeffrey Epstein story at the same time. You can't have it both ways, right?
Right.
He had a
and I think that it's quite clear that there is a satanic element to the establishment. I mean, that's history. You could take a look at the United Nations Meditation Room and the Lucis Trust, which used to be called the Lucifer Trust.
Yeah.
I mean, these people, going back to Blavatsky, and who influenced the Nazi movement and other, sort of like neo-pagan movements. It's all over the place when it comes to the most highest level elites in the world, not just in this country. And
totally undeniable.
Talking people like Bill Gates. I mean, I don't want to get into names, but some of these late night talk show hosts, I'm not going to mention names, who are just filled with this vicious and really over the top hatred for Trump.
Yeah.
There's a reason for that. He's trying to expose something.
Yeah, he took their kids away. He took their slaves away. No, it's 100% true. I mean, Alice Bailey wrote basically what turned into the UN Charter. She was a high-level occult person. Her book, Externalization of the Hierarchy, is basically the spiritual underpinning of the United Nations, published through Lucis Trust, of course.
Yes.
The Lucifer publishing company that they renamed Lucis Trust, as if that's somehow clever. And you look at people like Michael Aquino, was a high-level army intelligence who runs a cult, a black magic occult group called the Temple of Set. That actually almost joined at one point, believe it or not. Thank God I didn't, because I used to be into the occult and I was a Freemason, Rosicrucian, all this stuff, Golden Dawn. There's no question that these people are involved in the highest levels of specifically things involving the mind and psychology.
Right.
How to create brainwashed slaves and everything. And they just make themselves look dumb when they say there's nothing to it. It's all goofy. Obviously, there's something to it.
Sure.
And
it's become very injected into our society, starting with children, and that's certainly what Marx talked about. And he certainly was into apparently a good deal of satanic issues and things.
Well, you look at Netflix and TV. I mean, it's basically this country has turned into one giant open air satanic ritual abuse chamber. Between the things they put in your food, the things they put in your mind, which is actually worse. It's far worse to harm someone's soul than it is to harm their body. Especially with all the mask wearing and all this social distancing, they're doing the things to the public now that they perfected in their experiments in private in these little satanic ritual chambers. That's my theory, anyway.
I think it's a
That they
good one.
learned how to control people, and now they're just doing it kind of en masse.
And I think that as we said, the big steal is an example where everyone knows the election's being stolen. And the shocking thing is that younger people in particular either don't care or they think it's good because they've been conditioned to hate Trump. And
Yeah.
the people that have done the stealing, there's more and more evidence that's coming up, are younger people, teenage, like early 20s,
Yeah.
millennials who have been stuffing ballot boxes and who have been doing the actual footwork involved in stealing the election. And it goes to the communistic idea that they believe that whatever is necessary is good if it means that they're going to stop this evil man. And they don't question. It's like they're automatons.
They are.
They're not questioning that. They don't know why. There's nothing coherent with regard to what drives them. It's that they've been steeped in this educational system that is based on behaviorism as opposed to thinking cognitively.
Well, if you ask any of these people why they don't like Trump, they just kind of sputter and rant.
Right.
They can't give you an actual reason.
No, they have no idea. It's been day after day of mass, coordinated, orchestrated media brainwashing, where they just do it like it's kind of like the Chinese torture approach: drip, 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 every day another thing, and they will never say anything positive. And it has been, to a large extent, successful, and that's what's so frightening.
It has, because between mass media technology and advances in marketing and what they're doing in their little satanic chambers, this is the most advanced, ruthlessly powerful and effective brainwashing system that's ever been developed. What we go through in this country, between the media and schools, it's horrifying what they've been able to achieve.
And it's becoming hermetically sealed, and they've become very successful in banning and whitewashing anything that disagrees, and that no one seems to care. It's if this had happened maybe 20 years ago, there would have been up in arms, but they seem to be getting away with it now, which maybe shows how far this internationalist control mechanism has advanced. Now they have one factor they have in their favor now. They used to do wars, or they would have depressions or starvations or holocausts. Now they have the technological means to do it. They get satellites. They could implement chips into people. They can do computer manipulation, artificial intelligence. And that's what's really so scary about this to me.
Yeah, it's all about control over other people. That's the whole. It's what E. Michael Jones calls libido dominandi, right? The lust for power, the lust for control.
Well, his theory is quite brilliant when he talks about their use of sexual images and kind of the use of immoral tendencies that everyone has, to exploit those, to normalize those, to actually hold them up as virtues.
Yeah.
And thus we become enslaved. And I've interviewed Jones several times. I don't agree with him on anything. If you mention Judaism, his head blows up, but I don't get into that. But
I was thinking about mentioning it just now. I haven't decided yet whether to get into it.
But on other issues, he's brilliant, and he actually quotes from. He has a great quote in his most recent book, Logos Rising, which is great.
Yeah.
From St. Augustine, where Augustine quotes a parable where he talks about the slave and his master, and the slave says that I'm freer than you are because I only have one master, whereas you have as many masters as you have vices.
I like that a lot.
Yeah.
I'm actually in Indiana, in a town called Argos, in June of next year. Me and E. Michael Jones will both be giving speeches at what we're calling the Trad Forum.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if you have any interest in going, or whether we'll even be allowed to travel by June. I have no idea what the country's going to look like in June. It's all going to be Christian speaking. You might be the only Jewish guy there.
Yeah.
But it could be interesting if you want to come out there.
Thanks for telling me. Maybe I will. I mean, I'd love to meet all you guys. I mean, it's a.
Okay. I'll send you a link to the
Thank
event
you.
after this.
So, Michael, let my listeners and viewers know where they can get your latest books and where they can view your YouTube channel and whatnot.
Sure. I'm looking around to see if I have a copy of my book on my desk.
Mhm.
Of course, I forgot to bring that, right? You did the smart thing. You put the book behind you on the mirror here.
Well,
I don't have that option. So my latest book, Theopoetica, is on Amazon, Kindle, and paperback. The audio version is on Gumroad because Amazon keeps playing games with me about that, telling me I only had 1.5 seconds of silence instead of 2 seconds before a track. I put like a dozen hours in, it's just getting ridiculous. But if you want the audio version, you can email me and I'll sell it to you that way.
okay.
But they're on Amazon. And where is your book published, or is that a prototype?
It's published. No, it's on Amazon. It's available at bookstores if you want it. I actually, this time around, rather than just do it through Amazon, I published it through Ingram Spark, which makes it available as a soft cover in bookstores.
Oh, interesting. I know Amazon sometimes, have you had this yet, where Amazon will sell your book to bookstores? Like if you ever see a big batch of like 10 or 15 books selling at once, oftentimes it's to a bookstore, but they don't tell you what bookstore bought it. They won't tell you.
I think with Ingram, they actually have reps who go around and promote it to bookstores, and they have like metadata where they send it to bookstores, and so we'll see what happens. It's it's a pretty good service. It only costs $50 to publish with them, and they still make it available at all the big at Amazon and everywhere else. So I'm trying that this time around with this latest book.
Are you going to do a speaking tour or anything like that?
No, I mean, I'm doing interviews, but other than that, not really. I mean, it's not easy right now in the pandemic, but I just, to me, it's a great vehicle to have conversations like I'm having now with you. I mean, it's a great chance to get out and talk about God and try to reach people that way. And I've had some interesting ones. So it's strictly a promotion through YouTube and through podcasts.
Well, you might want to get a BitChute or DLive account because I have a feeling we're both going to be banned from YouTube pretty soon.
Oh, I'm already starting with that. I put my shows up on Rumble and on Podomatic, and I think there's this new one called Mind that I just started, and I think Gab is good also. I have an account there. I haven't really used it yet, but yes, I think you're right. YouTube now has come out flat out, I think yesterday, saying that they're going to remove programs that make reference to voter fraud. So
which is all of the right-wing channels are going to be gone, is what they're saying.
Exactly,
Max,
and that's the world we're living in. And if anybody needs any more proof of how controlled the media is and how absolute blackout we're seeing, it's that we now have information as of I think 2 days ago that Hunter Biden and Joe Biden's brother are being investigated by the FBI for money laundering. Now, that did not come out during the election because they didn't want that to come out. It was suppressed.
Yeah.
Now that their guy is safely ensconced, they're going to let it go out just before Christmas when no one's paying any attention. There might be a day or two of bad news, and then everyone's going to forget about it and move on. That's how they play.
That's their hope. I mean, if all the stuff I saw from Biden's laptop is real, then he's going to end up in prison.
Oh, yeah. No, there's, look at Spiro Agnew had to resign for a lot less because he was taking kickbacks. I mean, according to Hunter Biden himself, he gave 50% to the old man.
That's right.
Right? I mean, that's a kickback.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And that's what Giuliani said. It's a classic example of a crime family. So maybe, I'm sure he'll be first in line to prosecute if that becomes a real thing.
Yeah. And then we'll have Kamala Harris as the president of the United States.
You know what? I was just thinking about that today. So obviously, if Biden gets in office, he's going to retire probably within 2 or 3 months.
Right. I agree.
And I don't think a single Democrat is going to be upset about this because they don't know anything about Joe Biden to begin with. None of them voted for him because they like Joe Biden. They just hate Trump.
They just
hate Trump. The Democrat, why did you vote for Biden? What does Biden believe in that you agree with? They don't have an answer. So
no, it's just
they're not going to care.
Yeah, it's this brainwashing against Trump. They're not questioning it. And then, of course, the people on the inside of the conspiracy need to stop Trump because he's exposing the fallacy of their world order.
Yeah.
He's talking about things like sovereignty.
Everything rests with the Supreme Court.
It does. It does. And we'll just have to hope and pray, frankly.
Yeah. And there are military options if they fall apart. But
no, we don't want to go that way. It's not. That's not pretty.
No.
All right, Michael Whitcoff, listen, I want to thank you for joining me as always.
Thank you for having me on, Chuck.